This video lecture is going to focus on teaching 6 areas of the lesson plan template. I'm going to go through each of the 6 areas that will be the focus this week and talk briefly about what should go into each area and also what you should make sure you're including in each area in order to score highly on the rubrics. In order to make this run most effectively for you, I suggest that you have the lesson plan template up on your computer and follow along. It also may be helpful for you to have a hard copy beside you so you can write some notes beside it if there's anything that you really want to remember or anything that I might say that's not explicitly on the lesson plan template in front of you. I'm going to go through each of these 6 areas. Everything that you see here in green is, I think it's called melon, technically, melon green, is what we're going to talk about in this particular video. And I will tell you what each of those are. It may be helpful to right now go and circle or put a star beside each of the areas that we're going to talk about for this video. Clearly, you need to have your name on it. The second part is the grade level. The third part is the content area. The fourth part is the focus area or central focus. Those 1, 2, 3, 4 areas are all considered to be one part of the lesson plan. So that's the first part. The second is the standards, the connection to the standards. So here's where you'll write the content standards you're working towards. The next one is your lesson goal or objective, as well as anything that you're working on related to the IEP objectives. The next part is the pre-assessment strategies or tools, and the post-assessment strategies or tools, and then finally the assessment criteria or the rubric if you're using a rubric. So those are the 6 areas we're going to be talking about. I think the first parts are pretty obvious, the name, the grade level, and the age group, so that's going to be where your placement is taking place with who you're working with, what age group, what ability level, what grade levels. Also the content area. The content area would be one of 4 for most of you, so it's going to be language arts, science, math, or social studies. And then the focus area asks you to be a little bit more specific with the content area. So it may be something, if you're in language arts, it could be something like persuasive essays. For science, it could be biomes. For history, it could be Civil War. For math, it could be trinomials. So this is where you just get a little more specific with what the particular skills you're working on related to the content area you listed just above it. The next area is where you will put the content standard that you're working towards. And this is just going to the ODE site, searching content standards, putting in the grade level that you're working with, the subject area that you're working in, and finding that exact standard. Most of your teachers should have a copy of all of the standards that they work on in their particular class. And ideally, they're going to tell you which standard they want you to work towards. So I want you to make sure you're writing this out very, very explicitly. Don't shorten anything. Make sure you're using every word, every number that's included in that content standard. Also, this is where you want to consult the students' IEPs to see which students are working towards their IEP goals and objectives within this lesson. For CEC, so CEC is our accrediting body, the Council for Exceptional Children. They require that you have an IEP objective here. So in the class that you're teaching, you need to make sure you're identifying at least one student with an IEP objective that they're working towards in this class related to that content standard. I gave you boxes to check off to make sure that you're addressing each of the areas that need to be addressed. The first is that hopefully you can check off. I wrote out the entire content standard. The second is I explained how this lesson addresses a component of the content standard I have chosen. If you watched the video related to choosing a content standard and breaking that down into a lesson objective, this is where you want to explain how the objective that you have chosen will help move students towards meeting that content standard. So in the example that I provided, I chose to work on what a main character is and what a supporting character is. So all I would write in that case would be, in order for a student to be able to identify key story elements, they would need to know who a main character is and who a supporting character is. So that's just a basic explanation of how teaching the component skill that you're teaching is directly related to the content standard. And then the last one is I wrote all related IEP objectives. And again, CEC does require that you have at least one here. In a regular teaching situation, you would have more than one. But for the sake of this assignment, make sure you have at least one IEP objective that the student is working on in this lesson. All right, so the third section of the lesson plan is the lesson goals and objectives. This is, if you've had me before, you know that a correctly written objective has 4 elements: a condition, the student's name, or you could say class in this situation, an observable behavior, and a criteria. So your objective should be the exact same for this assignment. It should include those 4 elements. You should be able to check off these 4 boxes. My objective clearly defines what my students should be able to do at the end of the lesson. My objective includes a clear condition, students, observable behavior and criteria. I can hand this objective to a substitute teacher and he or she will know exactly what the assessment is. And lastly, the lesson objective I have written is directly related to the standard I have chosen and or the IEP objective. So it should be clearly aligned with what you have written above. Right. If you have a well-written objective, your objective tells you exactly what that assessment will be. We had talked somewhat briefly before in 230, and hopefully if you had 330 or 331, you've talked about this too, that whatever your assessment is going to be, so in your lesson objective, you have given a worksheet, given an exit slip, given 6 prompts. Whatever your condition is, that's what your assessment is. At the end of the lesson, you'll give that to the student. They'll be able to hopefully do well on it. Whatever your post-assessment is, you want to be able to take that data and compare it to the pre-assessment data. The only way to do that is if you make sure the pre-assessment and the post-assessment are pretty much exactly the same. If you want to be able to compare to find out if students made progress, they have to be very similar. So if you've written that objective that's high quality and it's written in the format that it should be, you will have a pre-assessment ready to go too, because it's the same. In the previous video of my example, I was giving the students a worksheet that had 2 columns, and the first column had said main characters and the second column said supporting characters. So in that case, that is also my pre-assessment. So that's what I would be describing here. Your pre-assessment and your post-assessment should be pretty much a copy and paste with a little more that goes along with it. So in order to check these boxes, you have to have included a pre-assessment that gauges each student's level of knowledge about the current lesson topic. And that means it can't be a general, how many of you know what a main character is, right? We have to know each individual student, what they know. My pre-assessment directly aligns with what will be taught in this lesson. So you should never be asking a student to do something on a pre or post assessment that isn't addressed directly in the lesson. My pre-assessment aligns with what will be assessed in this lesson. My pre-assessment directly aligns with the lesson objective. And my pre-assessment is differentiated for different learners and includes an explanation of why this is true. So you'll have to take into account students who may have accommodations or modifications, and what are you going to do within that assessment to make sure those students' needs are being met. So in the example that I had provided, it may be that you are going to have the characters already cut out for the student, or maybe you're going to sit with the student sit with the student, or have a classroom assistant sit with the student and read each character's name and read each of the columns to that student. Right, so those are just some ways you can differentiate. For older students that you all will be working with, it's going to look like a lot of different things. One of the best ways that you can answer these or you can approach this is to ask your placement people how they would differentiate an assessment. It's easy for me to just give random examples, but if you don't know each student, it's hard to really picture what I'm saying, or it's hard to understand why differentiating in that way makes sense for a student. So I would always ask what's best for the student, or what's going on in schools right now, what your mentor teachers are doing in their classroom. It's always the best approach. But some examples of how you're differentiating will be using different levels of questioning. You may, for a student who's lower performing, you might ask them more direct definition type questions, but then you'll also have to make sure you're asking those on the post-assessment too. And then for more advanced students, you could ask higher order or possibly more difficult questions, higher level thinking questions. It doesn't mean you can't compare the results. You can include different types of questions to get at each of those levels. So you might start with an exit slip that has a definition question for number 1, and by the time you get to number 5, you're asking them to be creative, which is a higher order thinking skill. And everyone can have that exact same exit slip, but you can explain that the reason why you're using the different levels is to make sure you're getting at the knowledge types and the knowledge levels of each student in your classroom. So make sure you're thinking through how your assessments will be appropriate for all of the students you would have in your class and be able to explain why it's appropriate. And post-assessment should look an awful lot like your pre-assessment. It's a lot of the same information. It should be related to the content standard, related to the lesson objective, related to IEPs. It's differentiated. And then the final point is that whatever the skill is you're asking students to demonstrate, you have already directly taught them how to do it in your lesson. So if throughout your lesson you're asking students to look at a clock and tell you what time it is, that's very different from then giving them a clock and saying, if it's 6 o'clock now, what time will it be in 2.5 hours? Right? So if you didn't directly teach that skill in the lesson or practice it, you can't ask it on an assessment. So make sure anything you're asking students to do at the end of the lesson, you have practiced that exact skill or that exact knowledge in your lesson. And the last piece is the assessment criteria or rubric. And this is just where you need to add some of an explanation of why your criteria is the right criteria to use. So if it's a very new or very difficult skill and you decide to set your criteria at 80%, absolutely fine. But just make sure you have an explanation for that. So you could say it's a rather new skill with a 50-minute period. I don't have time to get into, to make sure they've mastered the concept yet. This is an introduction to see what they know, what they retain. Whereas if this is going to be day 3 of working on the exact same skill, then it should be closer to 90% or 100%. But your criteria has to make sense with what your behavior is, but it also has to make sense with prior learning, the student's abilities, and the depth of the lesson. All right, so those are the 6 areas to focus on for this week. Because this is considered a flipped classroom approach, I'm just telling you what should go in each of these areas, and then you should be prepared to bring in a rough draft of all 6 sections to class. And then in class, we'll do some work with that.